Just by way of introduction, Pierre Fricke will be speaking on history and collecting of counterfeit money, present an introduction of these notes through the story of their creation, significance, how to collect, what books have been published on the subject. So with that, we'll turn it over to you, Pierre.
Thanks a lot, and good morning. I'm not sure anybody's got any kind of evening or night going on, but it's certainly morning here in San Antonio, Texas, and thanks for joining us today. So I'm going to talk about collecting Confederate paper money and the history of this, and how this played a significant role in our financial history, as well as was there actually a key element of the formation of the modern United States. And so let's get started. So the Confederate States of America is pictured here. And you'll see some things down here that a lot of people may not recognize or realize, but this is actually a holistic view. The Confederates were formed, the states were formed started becoming formed when South Carolina seceded in December 1860 after Abraham Lincoln won an election. And several other states joined across the lower South. The Confederates were formed states were formed in February in Montgomery. And they immediately needed to seek out a financial solution because United States money, banknotes, United States coins mostly, and banknotes were the main circulation medium at the time. And obviously they weren't part of the United States anymore. They needed to figure that out. And we're going to get into what that is in a minute. But before I do that, let's just say that the war started. There wasn't a war for a couple of months, and that's going to be important as we start off talking about some of the early Confederate notes. But a couple months, 2.5 months later, General Beauregard fired on Fort Sumter and Charleston Harbor in April. That started the war. Other states then seceded. Virginia, and that's Virginia is represented pre-1863 up there, with West Virginia as part of it. North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas. Indian Territory joined the South. It was most of the, not all the tribes, but many of the tribes joined the Confederacy and fought for the Confederacy. Some of them didn't, but most of them did. Interestingly enough, Arizona and New Mexico were configured differently. As you see to the left there, Arizona was the southern tier of what's known as Arizona and New Mexico, and that was a Confederate territory and joined the Confederacy. And New Mexico wasn't organized and never really was a factor. You'll also see Missouri and Missouri and Kentucky highlighted here. The Confederacy claimed to put stars on the St. Andrew's Cross and later renditions of the first national and second national flags with the 13 stars. But, and both of them had Confederate governments, but Kentucky really never was effectively controlled except for short periods of time in southern Kentucky. Missouri was cut off pretty early in 1862 after the loss of Pea Ridge in Arkansas, but there was a civil war within Missouri sort of on its own between Confederate forces and almost more like guerrillas, guerrilla warfare, and Union forces. Union controlled St. Louis, but the southern part of the state was controlled by Confederates and outlaws, and Jesse James and all those kinds of people were in there. It's got its own story of itself. So this is the Confederate States as it existed in June 1865. I think Arizona came in a little bit later than that. So they needed to create some money. And so immediately C.G. Memminger was, who was the Secretary of Treasury, appointed by Jefferson Davis, started looking at bonds and fiat paper money. There wasn't very much gold or silver in the South like there was in the North. I think there was like about 1/12 the amount of gold in the South as there was in the North. And the Confederates pretty quickly realized after the war started they needed to hold that for foreign trade and to help build some credibility on the financial markets. And so after a short trial with some coins in New Orleans Mint, with 4 half-dollar patterns that were made with basically out of a Liberty-seated 1861 half-dollar with the reverse stamped over with a new Confederate obverse, they did not make any coins. They did mint United States coins in New Orleans, Charlotte, and Dahlonega mints into 1861, into the Confederate period briefly, and those are highly sought after, but those were curtailed pretty quickly. So they went to paper money. There were 7 series of paper money authorized by the Congress of the Confederacy. The first issue was the famous Montgomery notes, which we'll show you in a few minutes. $1 million of those were issued. There were 3.65% interest-bearing bonds, actually, but they were used as money, and they were good for about a year, and then they were withdrawn. And I'm going to get into that a little bit. $1 million wasn't really a lot of money. The Confederacy actually depended a lot on coins to some extent at first, but the coins disappeared very quickly. All coins disappeared very quickly. So then it really was banknotes and local script and things like that. By 1864, the famous red notes with the blue backs were issued. More than 200 million were $1 million were authorized, and more than $400 million were issued. That doesn't sound like a lot of money in today's terms, but that was a huge amount of money to be floating around a country with a population of just a little over 6 million free people. There were many different printers. There was no Federal Bureau of Engraving or anything like that. There was no Confederate. There wasn't that in the United States, and there wasn't that in the South. There were private printers that Memminger contracted with. There's all kinds of crazy stories about how those printers backstab each other and spread rumors about each other and try to discredit each other to get business. That's sort of beyond the scope of this presentation, but there were private printers that produced the notes, and you'll see quite a variety of quality of notes. There were 70 different major designs. They're called type notes using the Criswell numbering system. Criswell has 72 types, but 2 of those types are actually not genuine Confederate official issues. They may be something else, and we can touch base on that as well. In addition to that, under the Confederate Constitution, the states actually had the right to issue money. The United States Constitution forbade the states from issuing money, but the states could issue money under the Confederate Constitution and did so. And mostly smaller change, but some larger notes as well. The Confederates didn't print anything less than a $5 bill, actually anything less than a $50 bill until mid-1861, and nothing less than a $5 bill until mid-1862. So small change was met by merchant script and state notes. There's a whole series of state notes. Most states issued notes, except for Tennessee did not issue state notes. They were overrun pretty quickly in Nashville. They used the Bank of Tennessee to sort of be their state issue, if you will. So they were obsolete notes. They're not officially state notes, but the Bank of Tennessee did the notes for the state there under the Bank of Tennessee moniker, obsolete bank notes. And South Carolina did the same thing. The Bank of the State of South Carolina issued notes, not the state of South Carolina. Interestingly, both those states issued notes under Reconstruction, which was sort of a unique period and beyond the scope of this presentation. So when I talk to people about collecting, I always recommend start with something that's relatively affordable and something that is well known and popular, easy to get, as opposed to the rarest. Now, so a lot of people say buy the rarest things first, and I think that's a good thing to do once you're familiar with what you're dealing with. So you want to buy books, we'll talk about those. And these are the notes that are famous, actually. These notes are well known. These are the red notes, the 1864 notes. There's 9 of them in the series, from the 50-cent note in the lower right to the $500 bill on the upper left. And so this represents a nice collection of 1864 notes, and quite affordable. In circulated grades, you could get this set for under $1,000, or around $1,000 maybe. In higher grades, it may be a couple $1,000s. So it's a very affordable set, very historic, very important for our history. Some of these things are pretty common, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But this is where I recommend people start. And once you do this, then and you get a feel for what the paper money is, then and the collecting and the hobby is, then it's good to then go spend as much money or as little money as you want after that. So now we're going to back up and say, okay, now we've started, let's get through the history here. So the Montgomery notes, as I said, were the first notes that were issued. These are the 4 Montgomery notes that were issued, 1,500, 150. There were 607 of these things issued on single sheets printed by the National Banknote Company in New York. Believe it or not, these were printed in New York. Keep in mind, between February 4th and April 12th, the United States and Confederacy were at peace. The United States didn't recognize the Confederacy, but there were people doing business across the lines. And Memminger sought out the highest quality banknotes he could find. There was hope that there wouldn't be a war. And so they contracted out with the usual suspects in New York, the American Banknote Company. The American Banknote Company printed the bonds and then contracted out to the National Banknote Company the notes. There was a second run issue of these notes and some more bonds in April 1860, printing, I should say, in April 1861. And that was just the 50s and hundreds because Memminger said he needed more lower denominations. He didn't need $1,000 was a huge amount of money. I mean, you didn't really spend that unless you were buying significant property or making a significant transaction. Even $50 was a large amount of money. But they issued another round of 999 500s and hundreds, or 50s and hundreds. Those were on a single plate, a half plate. Interestingly enough, they were almost captured. The war had started in April 12th. These notes were loaded on, or at least part of the printing was loaded on a ship in New York Harbor in April. Lore has it, it's not proven, but lore has it that federal agents were running down the dock to capture these bonds and this money, the 50s and hundreds, the second printing part of it. But the boat pulled away before they could before they can capture it. So we have a few more of these hundreds and 50s around than we might have otherwise. The federal agents did seize the plates from the American Banknote Company and National Banknote Company and destroyed them. No one was arrested because it was legal to do business with the Confederacy up until that point. So what did Memminger do? Memminger, again, the Secretary of Treasury for the Confederacy, had to look for money within his own borders. There was a branch of the American Banknote Company in New Orleans, renamed the Southern Banknote Company, that had some high quality steel plates. And these notes here also replaced the 50 and 100 from Montgomery's. The Montgomery issue, this is the first Richmond issue, although technically it's not the first Richmond issue. The series I'm going to show you next actually was issued before these. But it's called the first Richmond issue. These paid 3.65% interest, and about 5,700 of these things were made. Each one of these things were printed, so they're pretty scarce and popular. They're beautiful notes, very high quality design notes on very good banknote paper. So these were printed in New Orleans and began circulating around. In the meantime, Memminger needed a much higher volume source. Oh, before I say that, let me say that this is the steel plate that those were printed with. So most of the Confederate notes were printed on lithographic stones, but there were some steel plate issues, and this is one of them. This plate actually exists today, and it's in the Smithsonian Institution is where this plate exists. So Memminger also went to a printer in Richmond, Hoyer and Ludwig, a German descendants or immigrants that started up they had a printing firm going, and he contracted out for a larger quantity of notes in the tens of thousands, or even over 100,000 in a couple of cases. And these were the notes that were issued out of the July 25th Second Series Act from Hoyer and Ludwig, the 100, 50, 20, 10, and 5. You can see these notes these are lithographic stone printed notes, much more primitive, much more easily counterfeited, and some of these were counterfeited. The 5, 10, 20, and 50 were all counterfeited in some quantity, especially the 10 was counterfeited in quite a bit of quantity. So these notes are a lot more primitive. The other thing about these notes is that Hoyer and Ludwig initially used this thicker bond kind of paper that cracked, and when you folded it, it would crack and would not wear very well. And so the 5s and 10s in particular are very rare and grades better than very fine. And 5s are very rare in almost any grade, not damaged. So because these things heavily circulated because there was demand for paper money, because the coins had disappeared. You know, $5 and $10 gold pieces and all that stuff were hoarded, were not being spent. So these notes were printed and then were counterfeited. One other printer was used in this second series, July 25th, 1861. And this is Jules Manouvre in New Orleans. He printed this note. It was the first Confederate note to have a back. And you see the blue back at the bottom says Confederate States of America. This is actually a high-grade example. There was, I don't remember the exact number. I want to say 14, 15,000 of these printed. So it's pretty rare. It's a pretty rare note. The Maneuver printed a 5 too with a red back. I mean, a $10 version of this with a red back. And he shipped these to Richmond. All notes had to be shipped to Richmond to be hand signed and registered, the serial numbered and registered in the registry of the Treasury. And the shipment was broken into on the way on transit to Richmond from New Orleans. It wasn't secured very well, and all the 5s were recovered, but all the 10s were not recovered. So Memminger destroyed the 10s. The 5s were issued since they felt confident there wouldn't be falsely filled out ones circulating around. And so we have the Maneuver note here. Interesting story about the 10s. The 10s, we know they had a red back because it was described in the Treasury records that they were printed with a red back. No 10s have ever been found or seen. There's been quite a search for them over the years, including the hounding of the Jules Maneuver descendants. I think that's kind of faded out now, and I think it's been concluded that the other ones were all these were either destroyed or lost. It was speculated at one time, sometime earlier this century, that if one of these 10s materialized, it would bring up to $1 million. It would not have been an issued note. It would have been a falsely filled in note or a sheet of 4. But I don't think they would bring $1 million today, but it would still bring significant money. It might bring $1 million today. Who knows, right? You don't know what something like that would bring. Another interesting story about this is that this Maneuver also produced North Carolina notes and some of the other notes that were issued in the South. Even after he was fired by Memminger, North Carolina hired him to do some notes until New Orleans fell in April 1862. So we move forward. Memminger then sought out some more, he needed to seek more printers. So we still have the American Banknote, the Southern Banknote Company, the renamed American Banknote Company branch in New Orleans, printing the notes on the left. 50, there's a 20, a 10, and a 5. I don't show the 20 here, but you see these are some of the most beautiful notes in American history, actually, in my opinion, along with those first Richmond notes. Very high, again, steel plate, very high quality engraving. One of the very few notes Confederate notes that have embossing on it, which illustrates that it was done with a steel plate. And these are rare, not as rare as the Montgomery notes, but these are pretty rare notes. The 50 is a note that could run, 3,000 or 4,000 up to over 10,000 in better grades. These other notes down the 10 and the 5 are, start in the hundreds and go to the thousands depending on the grade. On the left, on the right, we see the top two $10 notes are done by Keating and Ball in Richmond, and then ultimately in Columbia, South Carolina, but these were done in Richmond still, here in 1861, going into 1862. Even though these are dated September 1861, they actually were printed all the way through 1862 in various stages. So Keating and Ball actually produced high quality notes as well. And here's two popular designs. The one with Hunter, that's RMT Hunter, the Secretary of State, up on the upper note with the baby. The baby was actually the child version of a famous, I don't remember his name off the top of my head, I should, abolitionist. It's interesting that a child's picture of an abolitionist appeared on a Confederate note, but they used whatever pictures they could get. The note below that was a repurposed Savannah Bank banknote plate re-engraved to have Confederate States of America on it for 5s and 10s. And those obsolete banknotes are popular because they have the same design, except that they have the bank name and stuff on them there. The lower right is the famous Indian princess because of this vignette on the right. That's an Indian princess. This note is, they only printed 7,000 of this note. Now that's quite a lot more than the Montgomery notes, but the Montgomery notes didn't circulate that much. So the survival rate of Montgomery notes is, upwards of 20%. Whereas the survival rate of this Indian princess is on the order of 2%, because these $5 bills circulated very heavily. To get one in better than fine that's not repaired is a feat that's could take a decade, although they do show up periodically. So that's a very rare note. Those go from in very low grade in the thousands. Most of them are in the tens or even 20s of thousands, depending on the grade. So what's going on in the meantime? Counterfeits appear in this 1860, well, more like the late 1861, early 1862 period. There was, since the Confederacy had all these non-standard designs that confused people, there wasn't an internet, there wasn't really good communication. We had telegraphs, but there was no telephone, no telephones, no TVs, no radios. It was all newspapers, pictures of notes or at the depositories. There was a network of local offices called depositories. The people that staffed them were called, the head of this office was called the depositary. And this is where you would exchange Confederate notes for bonds or get paid interest on these interest-bearing things and stuff like that. So there was a network of these offices. The counterfeits appear mostly in the North. A gentleman by the name of Sam Upham, who we'll talk about in a little bit, printed millions of these things, or many tens of hundreds of thousands of them anyway. And his notes were pretty crude, like the one on the upper right here. That would be an Upham note. They were woodcut. They weren't even lithographic stones. They were woodcut engraving and printing. And so that actually looks kind of like what the note looked like. And if you didn't really know what paper it was supposed to be on and what it really looked like, you could be fooled by it. Although today we know pretty at a quick glance that that's a counterfeit. So the stock vignettes didn't help. There's a lot of vignettes that appeared on obsolete banknotes. The different papers, people didn't know what was a good paper or not. Confederate notes were printed everything on high quality banknote paper to that garbage like bond paper, very thin quality, kind of quality paper. The counterfeit started appearing on both the July 1865 and September 2 notes, and there was a panic. In August 1862, the Hoyer and Ludwig notes that I showed you on the previous slide, going back to here, these notes, some of these notes, and a couple of the later ones in that series, like these notes here, these were Hoyer and Ludwig notes as well. People began to realize that some of these notes weren't real, and there was a panic, and so people started shunning the money. In particular, a gentleman, the depositary in Charleston named Presley, caught some of these things, and that stimulated a panic. Now, what did the panic do? The panic slowed down commerce. People were reluctant to take the money. They wanted coin, or they wanted letters of credit on a bank. For smaller change stuff, they wanted state notes or local scrip. They would do that. But that really threw sand in the gears of commerce and actually slowed the Confederate commerce down. And actually, that was the thing that damaged this. People say, well, this was the main purpose of this was to drive inflation. The main damage was inflation. It wasn't really that much inflation. I mean, the Confederates were printing money left and right and doing their own thing with inflation. And part of the inflation was driven by the blockade, shortages of goods. The real damage of this stuff that these counterfeits did was it caused a lack of faith in the money. So it slowed down commerce. It made commerce harder to conduct. And and we're going to get into that in a little bit about how the way this money would cause some problems. So these counterfeits began to appear. There was a panic. Here's a comparison between the genuines and the counterfeits. So here's the genuine notes are on the left, the counterfeits are on the right. I should go back and say something about these two bottom notes. These two bottom notes are actually high quality counterfeits made during the war. They almost certainly were not made by Sam Upham. They were probably made by a gentleman named Winthrop Hilton in New York. And Hilton was an interesting character. He also counterfeited United States money in New York. The government never really could catch him on it. But Jefferson Davis actually instituted a sting that trapped him. So Jefferson Davis had spies in New York, and one of the spies set up set up some communications and faked some communications with Hilton that made it look like Hilton was dealing with a Confederate agent to actually print money for the Confederate government, which would have been treason. And so Hilton was arrested because he was arrested for conspiring with the Confederate government to print money for the Confederate government, where in reality he was actually counterfeiting the Confederate money. So Jefferson Davis pulled off a coup here by getting Hilton arrested and taken out of circulation, printing very high quality notes. compared to the Upham notes above. Sam Upham advertised his notes. He had facsimile in the margins to help sidestep the anti-counterfeiting laws. The union, it's never been proven the union was behind any of this. There's no documentation that says the union paid for any of this stuff, supported any of this stuff. But they turned a blind eye to Upham, and they turned a blind eye to Hilton until he was thought to be conspiring with the enemy. And I'll just say one thing, that the federal government probably was involved covertly. And the reason why I say probably is because I can't prove it, but Union soldiers were found spending this money in the South. And Union soldiers didn't need to spend money in the South. They could take what they wanted. But even more damningly, the Confederate parolees, when the Confederates and Union would exchange prisoners, like the South would give 10,000 free 1,000 prisoners, and the North would free 1,000 prisoners to be in exchange, so that they didn't have the burden of keeping these people in these prison camps and feeding them and all that sort of stuff. General Grant ended that practice, by the way, but putting out in 1864 when he had the power to do so because it favored the South. But Union or Confederate parolees were found spending this money too, and you can imagine a Confederate somebody being released from Elmira, New York. Probably didn't have Confederate money in their pocket, and all of a sudden they're found spending this money. Somebody gave it to them, probably the federal government. So these are the genuine notes here on the left. These are the counterfeits on the right. The easy ways to tell is the designs look a lot more primitive on a lot of these things. They have printed signatures. They don't have serial numbers, or they have printed serial numbers in many cases. So that really kind of tells the tale. The other tale is that the design, George Trumbull has a book that highlights the design features. There's too many spokes on the wheel here. There's significant differences in the sailors' pictures down here, et cetera. So there's ways to tell these things. It's not really that hard to tell most of them. And you have books to refer to help figure that out. Here's Sam Upham, the Philadelphia gentleman that was probably the most famous counterfeiter of the war. Born in Vermont, he was part of the Navy. He joined the U.S. Navy in the 1840s. Upon release of the Navy, he was part of the gold rush in 1849, wasn't very successful. He was a little more successful as a newspaper man, but he never really made his fortune out west. He went back east, opened a stationery shop in Philadelphia in the late 1850s until 1863. Part of his deal was to counterfeit Confederate money, and he sold it and advertised large amounts of Confederate money for pretty low prices. Winthrop Hilton would charge 10 to 20 times as much money, but his quality was better, would fool more people. Upham sold his operation to John Cromer, who used the CS counterfeits. He continued to print some of these CSA counterfeits, and he put ads for his hair dye, Cromer hair dye, on the back, which are pretty popular collectibles. Moving forward into 1862, further we get to the 1862 $100 interest-bearing, 7.3 interest-bearing notes. These were paid twice the interest of the 1861 Montgomery notes. And they're pretty famous. Here's the famous train. Here's the famous, slaves hoeing cotton. The slaves did appear on the notes. It was certainly part of the society and part of the war. And it appeared in the notes, and this is, part of it. So these things were kind of interesting in the sense that these notes, they paid interest, and there was a system that the Confederate government put in place to pay the interest. And you'll see some interesting markings in the back here. These notes would be issued on the back, and the military used a lot of these notes to pay for supplies from sutlers, food, and they would use these notes to pay for armaments and things and ammunition stuff. And various quartermasters or assistant quartermasters, like this guy James Hightower, that's signed the back of this one at the top here, would issue the note. That's when the interest would start accruing. Issued September 9, 1862. So when they went to depository in Savannah, right below that, Savannah, 1863, January 1, they would collect interest starting in 1862. And that interest would be paid in, depends on how many of these notes you brought, that interest would be paid in other Confederate notes or small change, scrip or credit, when you got enough to get larger denominations, or you'd fund them into bonds. You get bonds in some cases if you wanted to turn these things in and fund them into bonds. The $100 bill down and below, this is a type 39, by the way, up here, Criswell type 39. The one below is a Criswell type 41. The one below is, they were also had the places issued. This is issued in Bonham, Texas in April 2, 1863. When you got the military signatures on the back, or these place issued on the back, they have more value, sometimes a great deal more value. These notes and these grades here would be $75 roughly, the stain and the have pretty circulated notes. But with this high tower, it's probably $300 or $400 or $500. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head, high tower, but I think it's even more common, maybe $500, $400. Bonham, Texas, it'd be a few $100 versus $75 as well. Another thing I'd say about this, and let me just stop here and tell you something interesting, more interesting about these notes. These notes, one of the things about the South is that when they produced later series of notes, sometimes they would force people to turn in the old notes. In particular, the law of 1864 forced all the earlier Confederate notes to be turned in or be taxed out of circulation with a 33% tax. These notes here weren't forced to be turned in before the end of the war, but some people would turn them in anyway because they wanted the bonds, or they wanted they needed the money for some reason in a different form, and or they spent them and somebody else turned them in. So these local offices would collect notes that were funded into bonds or something else, and they would cancel them with knife cuts or holes. You'll see these notes with cuts in them and things. Particularly, these kind of notes, back there. And these 1862 and 63 notes, which I'll talk about in a second, these kind of notes. So these notes would be canceled and turned in. The depositories would just store them. And so an interesting story about some of these notes here in particular is that Sherman, marched through Georgia in 1864 after he captured Atlanta in the late fall of 1864. And he passed through a lot of towns. And contrary to popular belief, Sherman didn't burn everything. His guys had a good old time taking a lot of stuff, and they did burn a lot. But Sherman's official policy was burn any military installation, tear up the railroad tracks, and they would not only tear the railroad tracks up, but they would take the rails and twist them, heat them up and twist them around trees so the Confederates couldn't use them again. They did a lot of damage, but some cities were left. I mean, if a city resisted, they would burn it down. But if a city didn't resist, it didn't. The capital of Georgia was in Milledgeville. He captured Milledgeville in November 1864. They surrendered peacefully. He didn't burn the town. He occupied it for a little while, and he left. In Milledgeville, he captured the depository, and actually his soldiers loaded all the canceled money on wagons to bring with them. So that was, they were traveling towards Savannah, and they had wagon loads of money, literally some number of wagons of canceled Confederate money, because Milledgeville was a large depository, and it had a lot of the canceled notes that were turned in for interest payments or for bonds or something else. And of course, Sherman, as he passed through, the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, and the slaves would follow him because they had nowhere else to go. And so large swaths of slaves were following Sherman, and he didn't know what to do to disperse. He couldn't feed them. He had to forage the countryside just to feed a 60,000 man army, and he wanted them to disperse. So they tried various techniques, some of which weren't very good, very, very, very humane. But one of which was kind of interesting was they opened up some of these wagons and started throwing money out the back to disperse the slaves. Because the slaves say, "Oh, money, let's go get the money." Heck, this was $100 bills and $5 and $10 bills. It was a lot of money to anybody, much less a freed slave that had no money. So they tried to disperse the slaves by throwing money off the back. One of my customers was an African American from Georgia who was a descendant from one of Sherman's freed slaves, and he actually his great grandfather, because he's older than me by some years, so it would have been his great grandfather, I think. Knew that the $100 bills were the best ones to get, and grabbed a bunch of these, particularly the ones with slaves on them, and he kept them as souvenirs. His great grandfather kept them as souvenirs and passed them down in the family. And the story along the lines was, "This is the first money I received as a free man," and then the picture on the note, which obviously obviously is not pleasant because of slaves. He actually looked at it as a positive thing in the sense that this is what I was freed from. So that's why he kept these things, and he passed them down to his descendants. Well, the person I talked to was his great grandson, and they didn't have enough more notes to pass down to any more descendants. So he bought some at $7,500 a piece in different grades, somewhere between this grade and a little bit better, and passed them out to their descendants. I thought that was a pretty cool story, that this money touches people in many ways. That was a very interesting way that someone used pass us notes down in their family to remember what they were freed from and what they got as their first notes when they were freed. Interestingly enough, his great grandfather couldn't really spend it anywhere. There were things he could have bought, although not many things, because Sherman didn't leave much behind. But the second thing is, as a freed African American, once the Union soldiers passed through, Confederate cavalry would have captured you and sold you back into slavery. So they really didn't. That's why he kept it. He had nothing he could spend it on, and he stayed with Sherman's army as opposed to trying to go back on his own. I thought that was a pretty interesting story with the money as we go forward. Moving into 1862 and 63, we finally see the small change, the ones and the twos appear. We've got backs now on the notes to help with counterfeiting. Some of the notes are have watermarks from English imported paper, and so we see these designs become standardized. All the 50s now are Jefferson Davis, Keating and Ball issues. The 10s have the Capitol building of Nashville with Hunter, etc. So these notes all standardized. And here's one of the reasons why the Confederate system wasn't really as good as the Union system. The Confederate system, Memminger, in February 1864, when they started with the 7 series of those red notes I showed you, wanted to try to control inflation. Inflation was running out of control in 1864. I guess they didn't realize that they were printing all this money, didn't have anything to do with it. So they tried to constrain the money supply and cancel all the old notes. So they taxed all the old notes out of circulation, and you had to upgrade to the new notes. You had to go to your depository, turn the old notes in, and get your new notes. And if you waited until after March or April 1864, if you were east of the river, or July 1864 west of the river, you only got 67 cents on the dollar after that. So you were very incented to turn these in. That's why a lot of 1863 and 62 notes are canceled versus the 1864 notes that aren't canceled, because the 1864 notes were never replaced. So Memminger put this tax in place to try to shrink the money supply, and it worked. Actually, the Confederate dollar increased in value as it related to gold a little bit in mid-1864, not to mention that the Confederates had both Sherman and Grant bogged down in front of Atlanta and in front of Richmond, and it looks like the war was going to drag on past the election inconclusively, which might have cost Lincoln the war. In the summer of 1864, before that's what it looked like was going to happen. So the Confederate money actually went up in value some because of this. But the problem that's introduced, and the problem they had some other milder versions of this earlier in the war. The problem with this tax out the old notes to force people to the new notes is that all the notes that were printed in Columbia, South Carolina, or Richmond had to be signed by the Treasury Bureau and serial numbered and registered and then circulated out. Well, the further west you got away from Richmond, the harder it was to get notes to it. And the railroad system was breaking down, and the Union was breaking it up, and especially by 1864, but even earlier in the war, this type of monetary system had a big problem. So the New Orleans would fall. Let me check the time here. New Orleans fell partly because the Confederates couldn't pay the contractors that were building an ironclad like the Merrimac, called the Louisiana. So the contractor stopped work on that boat and didn't finish it in time, even after they got money to start it up, so that they had to blow it up versus use it against Farragut's fleet. So money had a direct impact on the war in New Orleans. So that's what this did. In west of the Mississippi River, they reissued the old money that was not really valid for circulation. They got a special law. They reissued the money, and they put these Trans-Mississippi stamps. The Trans-Mississippi region was west of the river, and so you'll see these stamps that were on the money, and those are premium value as well. Here's the 1864 notes. Here's the blue back that is pretty well known. This is, we talked about these notes before. There was, the most common Confederate note is that $10 bill at the bottom. There were 10 million of those printed. There's probably about 2 million of them that survive today. So 2 million people can have a Confederate note if you fully distributed the 10s. Obviously, some of these other ones are got some pretty good numbers around. The 500 is the rarest here. 500 you can get for between $300 and about $3,000 roughly, depending on the grade and the color. The redder these notes are, the more valuable they are. Red notes are more valuable than pink notes. There were watermarks. A lot of this paper was imported from England, and some of it was smuggled in the Union. You can actually get 2 different Confederate types written with New York, NY, New York paper. They're rare. They're a premium note, but New York countermark paper was smuggled in the Union, 1 ream of it. These other things down here, Watman, Hodge, Wookey Hole Mill, J. Green and Son were English papers that were imported. CSA script was done in South Carolina. Some of these things represent major rare varieties. There are also some interesting errors on this. These plate letters should be the same, but you'll find that the plate letters are mismatched, CG. That's a significant error in a major collectible. You know, an otherwise $30 note could be worth anywhere from $500 to $1,500, maybe more. And down here you see the ratification clause, 6 months after a ratification of a treaty of peace, and 2 years after the ratification of a treaty of peace. And the second clause should say between the United States and Confederate States. Needless to say, there was no treaty of peace, so these things never paid out. The modern fakes versus real. Some people get scared. Well, Confederate money's got all these counterfeits and fake notes and all that. So we talked about the counterfeits made during the war. There's a whole book on those. They're easy to tell. Generally, there's a few of them that are trickier to tell, but Tremel's book would help you with that. There's also a lot of souvenirs, ad notes, and not so much counterfeits to fool people, although there's a few from the 70s and 80s that are made on paper. They're almost all easy to tell. Here's the difference between a genuine note and a real note. You know, this is the Slaves Home and Cotton T41. I mean, the color's wrong. They don't have a back like that on the left. This is probably one of the Cheerios, a variation of the stuff that you used to get in boxes of Cheerios in the 50s and 60s. The real note looks like this on the right. Big difference, easy to tell. Same sort of here. Here you see a $5 bill. This actually says facsimile down here on the bottom. This must be a more modern souvenir copy that you might have bought at Stuckey's or Gettysburg or something on the road. But this stuff, again, wrong color, wrong paper. The paper is the wrong kind of paper. And you can see the design of the back in particular is pretty far off. So most of this stuff is easy to tell. One of the most famous counterfeits is the 297 on parchment. You don't know how many, luckily I don't get too many phone calls. Now it's all email. But you don't know how many emails I get with, I got a $1,000 Confederate note worth $20,000 or something. And I ask them what serial number it is. They say 297. I said, well, it can't be real. And I'll tell you why the 297 can't be real in a second. But well, it can't be real because 297 is in the New York Public Library in the Emmett collection. So if you ever see anybody tells you they got a $1,000 Confederate note and the serial number 297, can't be it unless they stole it out of the New York Public Library. This is, you can tell, there's a huge difference here. Any non-Confederate note looks like this one above. And there's other Southern state notes and United States War of 1812 stuff that were souvenirs made in the 60s and 70s or whatever. That stuff isn't real. There's several books. I'm probably running a little bit long here. Let me just breeze through the books. This is a mass market book that I published some years ago with through Shire in the UK. It's distributed by Random House. It's out of a mass market book. It's a nice history book, 56 pages, $10 retail. This is the Standard Guide, 2014. This is a 575-page book. Its street price is around $30 plus shipping. Retail was $40. This gives you everything you need to know about what we're talking about here and how to collect. And the prices are a little out of date, but they're still useful. And you know, I've got an updated PDF for the type price guide. And people ask me when I'm going to do another one of these. I work in high tech, so I haven't had time to really do another one of these. I'm going to do another one of these in probably 2022. I want to say somewhere around there, which looms large. It's already 2020. So there's going to be a new one of these, a 5th edition or 4th edition, sometime not in the too distant future. I mentioned George Tremel's books. He did one in 2003 and then one through Whitman in 2007. The Whitman book is outstanding, except for the prices. Don't use the prices. But the rest of the book is outstanding for telling what the these are the counterfeit currency of the war. These aren't the counterfeit currency, the souvenirs after the war. There's other information on the internet about those post-war souvenirs as well. The history of collecting. Fred Reed and I did a book on the first part of the first 80 years of collecting Confederate money after the war. There's a great rich history of collection here. Along with large cents, colonial coins, and colonial paper money, Confederate paper money represented the earliest parts of a hobby. These things were affordable. I mean, they were worthless effectively. Confederate notes were not worth very much of anything. Even Montgomery notes became worth, $2, $3, $5 pretty quickly. But most of the things you could buy those piles of 1864 notes for, a penny or 10 cents or something for quite a long time. So they became very popular and in our hobby. I mean, people couldn't afford to collect $20 gold pieces and silver dollars back then, but they could certainly afford to collect this and large cents and half cents and colonial paper. And this is very much part of the fabric of our early numismatic history in the United States, starting in 1865. There were auctions in New York. There was an auction in 1865, right after the war. A $1,000 Montgomery note sold for $4.50. A $500 Montgomery note sold for $2.50. Those have gone up quite a bit. Just a couple of interesting fun facts. The first Confederate note to reach face value was that Maneuver note, that $5 Maneuver note I showed you that was made in New Orleans. That reached a $5 value in 1880s. The Montgomery set, the 1,550 and 100, reached face value in 1960. And actually, Johnny Rose sold that. He's still alive as a dealer in Dallas. Sold that set for $1,650 in 1960, 99 years after the beginning of the war. I talked about the military issues and the agents and stuff. There's a book done by Mike McNeil on that. These are available for $50. The retail is $90 on the book. The future, I mean, I think we've got lots of information, lots of community online on these things. Type notes is still a popular way to go, either a 9-note set or up to a 70 or 72 note set with 2 fantasy notes. Focus sets are kind of king. You don't need a lot of money to have a lot of fun. If you want to get into varieties, there's a lot of interesting errors and other watermarks and history behind those. The place issued and the military issues are really popular. Stamps on the back and faces are gaining popularity. We're transitioning from one generation to another right now. So there's, it's actually, some prices are up quite a bit, but some are soft. So it's actually a pretty good time materials available. It's actually a pretty good time to collect this. There's more talk about slavery role in the war on the money. And you'll hear me say, the number one reason why the Confederacy lost the war is because of slavery. Slavery was the thing that obviously they abused, misused, and didn't have on their side. 3 million of the 9 million people who live in the South had the Confederates freed the slaves. They, instead of the 200,000 of them fighting for the Union, there may have been 300,000 or 400,000 of them fighting for the South. That would have made a big difference. The other big issue with the slavery was the British and the French were never gonna support Confederacy with slavery. So that really was the thing that killed them more than anything. Because if they had the African Americans fighting for them instead of against them, and they had the British come in on their side, that would have been a totally different game. The second reason they lost the war was finances, because the way the money was hodgepodge and the counterfeiting and the having to go turn it into depositories and get new money and shortages of money and things like that. And then, the Civil War sesquicentennial passed this last decade. We got a bicentennial coming up. I'll be pretty old by then in 2061, but there's a lot going on. And with that, I'm going to stop and we'll go to questions.
All right, thanks a lot, Pierre. If anyone has questions, they can enter them in the Q&A. We have one question. Is this material today found more frequently in the South, or has it been pretty well distributed by now?
It's been pretty well distributed. Actually, the first collectors weren't in the South. The first collectors were in the Northeast. Union soldiers brought this money home as souvenirs. Northern numismatists or people with a penchant for collecting got very interested in this and the history of this. And the first books, and I've got a whole other presentation on the history of collecting, which I may do another time. But it was actually a lot of this ended up in the Northeast early on. Now, the South, a lot of it remained in the South. the Southerners, they either disdained it, because they lost, it became worthless. They really weren't happy with that, or they saved it in attics and trunks. Some of it used was play money. A lot of it's been destroyed because of that. They passed it to kids. The Union soldiers used it for poker. What else? It was used for insulation. It's been known that you could walk in an old house sometimes, although I think this has become rare now. But occasionally you'd find wallpaper on a wall. Confederate money uses wallpaper on a wall. But it's pretty dispersed. There are occasional small hoards still coming out in the South. The biggest hoard is the Richmond hoard that was captured out of the Richmond Depository by Union soldiers when Richmond fell. That is the Smithsonian hoard now. There's several 100,000 notes, mostly 1863 and 62 canceled notes in the Smithsonian Institute. That's where the largest group of these things are, several 100,000 notes, mostly common 1863 and 62 in the Smithsonian.
All right, another question. Can you talk about resources for identifying populations of Confederate notes similar to PCGS and NGC coin census?
So, PMG and PCGS, LCG currency maintain legacy currency, and I think PCGS banknote will now too, maintain registry sets and what do they call it? Population reports. It's there's the vast majority of Confederate money hasn't been certified yet, so those things will give you some idea of some scarcity in certain grades, but it's not going to tell you what the population is. The certification of this is nowhere near as far along as coins are. That being said, a lot of the better notes have been certified. There's a good number of Montgomery certified out of the 140 T1s, type $1,000 bills. A good number of them have been certified, but a lot of them haven't been yet. The other places that I actually published in my 2005 book, and on the DVD of that History of Collecting, I published a rare variety condition census. So that's a census and provenance and grade using old traditional grading, and I've started putting slab grading in where we know it of the rare varieties. I maintain that census. It's kind of like the large cent, if you're familiar with the large cent condition census that Del Bland used to maintain, or that Bill Noyes have maintained. It's kind of like that. So I have that. That's published in that 2012 book. I'm going to probably republish that on the internet at some point. That'll give you some idea of the rare variety census. Beyond that, in my book, in my 2014 book, I'll give you some idea of rarity of grade. We have some rough idea of the survivability of these things, and we know some of the notes are very rare in fully framed high grade. But we don't know the population count beyond some of the a statistically valid sample in PMG and PCGS, but that's not the whole population or anywhere near the whole population yet.
All right, attendee asks, I used to collect the last series and would find stamps sometimes on the corner or the reverse in red, not a complete stamp, but a partial stamp. What is the significance of this, if any?
That was a treasury stamp stamped on the sheets before they were cut. That's why you see partial stamps, because it tended to be in the corners of the notes. And that was an anti-counterfeiting device. By 1864 and 1863 and 64, they were concerned about counterfeiting. They used different ideas to minimize that. That was one of them.
All right. Another question. A lot of the Southern obsolete pre-Civil War notes were printed in the North. Were any of the Confederate notes printed in the North, and if so, by who?
The only Confederate notes printed in the North were the Montgomery notes at the beginning I showed you. Those were printed at the National Banknote Company in New York City. That operation was shut down on April 16th or 18th, a 3 days after Fort Sumter. I don't remember the exact day, but it was a day or two after Fort Sumter surrendered, and Lincoln called for 75,000 troops. That was shut down, and there was no notes printed in the North. Now, those counterfeits, Sam Upham, as a private individual, not a government agent, printed all kinds of souvenirs, as he called them, or facsimiles. Hilton in New York printed a lot of stuff, but those were counterfeits. There was all the rest of the notes were printed in the South. They were printed in Richmond, New Orleans, and Columbia, South Carolina, where I think those are the main places that stuff was printed.
All right, another question. Person asks, I was at a coin show last year and one dealer told me nobody wanted Confederate money anymore. Is there a trend toward a decreased amount of collecting out there?
I haven't seen it. You know, I mean, things kind of ebb and flow like anything else. But if anything, every time, I will say this, every time there's a statue flap, my book sales triple on Amazon. You know, this is not a celebration of this history of the past. This is actually a remembrance and artifacts of that period. They're not in the town square. They're not statues in the town square or anything like that. This is actually an important part of our history that people actually want to preserve. At least most people do, and people get interested in this, what it meant and what it was. So I've actually seen an increase in collecting at some level, and certain kinds of ways. There's an increased interest in 1864 notes, 1863 notes. Those have actually gone up in value, particularly at high grade. People want certified notes more than they did in the past. So there's there's prices going up on those fronts. Some of the traditional rare notes have softened a bit because the new generation that's coming in hasn't graduated to that level of finance yet. But it's actually a pretty good time to buy those because those, when it won't take too much interest to dry it up. I mean, the population of a lot of those rare notes is minuscule compared to coin. More, if you think in terms of Morgan dollars or Indian cents and that kind of stuff, with the exception of the 1864, 63 common notes and circulated grades, most of this 1861 stuff, the rarer ones are, I mean, a 1909 SVDB penny and uncirculated is a common coin compared to most of those things. So it doesn't really take a lot of people to change the value in the market. So there is interest. I haven't seen collecting fading. If anything, this pandemic, it seems to be strengthening more in recent months because I can't buy stuff as easily as I could last year. And buying good stuff never easy.
All right, another question. Would you recommend that beginners focus on buying certified notes, and are there enough of them out there given the low population?
There's certainly enough 1864 notes, 1863 notes, and common notes for people to buy, and they're more sort of being certified all the time. Now, you're not, one mistake people make is they assume they're going to go buy a bunch of Gem-Unk 65, 64 kind of notes. And I will tell you, once you get outside 1864, you're not going to find them. They're extremely rare. So you can buy AU 58s, 63s. And the reason why that is because Confederate notes were cut in piles of sheets by hand with shears. So they're not trimmed very well. And the trim and the color actually is very important for value. And for uncirculated notes, the trim will drive the grade up. The grading services really don't take into account trim on lower grade notes, even though it affects value quite a bit. But you can certainly collect if you're going to collect AU or UNC notes, you want to probably get them certified. If you're going to collect fine to very fine $30 note, if you want to collect $30 notes and $50 notes and $25 notes, of which you could probably get 2 or 3 dozen Confederate notes, maybe 3 dozen different types, under $50. You're not going to buy those certified. You just want to buy them from a trusted dealer. It costs $20 to certify a note or more, actually with the fees, depending on how many you send in. So many notes, much less than $100, aren't going to be certified unless they're done in bulk. Sometimes I've certified, $75 notes in bulk, where I get a dealer discount and the postage is amortized. So if you're going to collect cheaper notes under $100, especially under $50 to $60, then get them. You're not going to get them certified very easily. For higher grade, if you're buying high grade notes, uncirculated notes, you probably want to get them certified. If you're buying rare notes, you either get a trusted dealer, and you read my book and you understand what you're doing at some level, or you buy certified. And even when you're buying certified notes, you're going to want to understand the cut and the color, because a PMG, let's say a PMG very fine 25 note that's trimmed in the margin with dull color may be worth $500, let's call it. If it's fully framed with bright color in a PMG 25 note, it may be worth $1,500. So there is these things aren't like stocks where you plug them in to a formula and say, well, a VF25 note's always worth the same amount of money, because it's not. IAPL account, just like a toned dollar, Morgan dollar may be worth a lot more to some people than an untoned Morgan dollar in the same grade. It's sort of the same kind of thing. IAPL, the grading services do a good job with putting a floor on abuse, detecting repairs and things like that. And they do a good job with technical grading, generally speaking. But there is a variety of quality within the holders, like there isn't anything else. These things are unique pieces of art.
All right, it looks like that's the end of the questions. So Pierre, thank you very much for providing this overview. This is a very useful, I thought. I'm not a paper money collector, but I found it fascinating. A lot of history here and a lot of interesting notes from the period.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right, so thank you. We'll wrap it up and stay tuned for our next presentation. Thanks, Pierre.
Right. Have a good day.